so funny. So, Michael, your book, How to Change Your Mind, was published in 2018, I believe. And ghoul is not in it. Can you tell us why?
It's one of many oversights. Well, Ghoul's, at that point, was known for her research on MDMA. And she'll tell us a little bit about it. Fascinating research that I was aware of, I'd heard of. But I made a decision when I was writing How to Change Your Mind not to deal with MDMA. Despite a lot of lobbying from Rick Doblin and like that. And the reason was that it was too much material, and it had a different pharmacology, it had a different social history than the classic psychedelics, like psilocybin and LSD. So, you know, when you're writing a book, you're always drawing lines around your subject so it doesn't sprawl, and it was long enough as it was. So, and to this day, I haven't written about MDMA, which is weird.
So you made up for that oversight by getting her to come to Berkeley and recruiting her from Johns Hopkins, and we'll hear more about that. But I do want to ask about one choice that you made, I think, pretty soon in the book, which is not to treat psychedelics like a cure-all, like that they are just, you know, always good for everybody, gonna change the world, gonna bring us all peace. What was behind that choice, and how now do you feel that the work that you're doing continues to make sure that that's not something that is the main conversation?
Yeah, well, you know, we've seen this hype cycle with psychedelics. We're in the midst of it now, and there's sort of a backlash actually happening right now, which was completely foreseeable. You know, before I was a writer, I was an editor, and I know how editors think. And if you've read 10 positive articles on psychedelics, the only thing you want is a negative article on psychedelics. It's just the way journalists are. I'm glad you think I was sufficiently skeptical in that book. When I look back, I think I was a little too positive. And didn't pay enough attention to risk and the fact that some people really get into trouble with psychedelics and they're not for everybody. I think I would have, knowing what I know now, would have dealt more with risk and harm reduction and those kind of questions, because a lot of people took this book as a guide and started using psychedelics. But at the time, we have to go back to the time, in 2000, I was writing in 2016 and 17, and public opinion was universally negative about psychedelics, except for a very small group of researchers and psychonauts. And so I was pressing against a public that thought they were really dangerous and evil, and I was trying to make the case that no, we should really take this seriously. There's something here.
You know, it strikes me that you begin by telling the story of a developmental psychologist at UC Berkeley who, you know, is sort of the last person you would have thought would talk about at a dinner party, the trip that she went on. And it's this person who studies children and like how much more innocent can you be, and yet talks about how children are just tripping all the time. Like that.
Yeah, when she used LSD for the first time, what caught my ear at this dinner party and kind of inspired the book, along with learning about some of the research underway, was that she was describing a psychedelic trip on LSD, and I listened more closely, and you know, she was a woman in her 60s or just about, and I expected her to say back in college, but she said 2 weeks ago. Like, oh, this is really interesting. Someone like that is using psychedelics, and then she started talking about how it gave her insight into the mind of children, who she really thinks their consciousness is very trippy, in that a 4-year-old has an inability to focus really narrowly. They don't have what she calls spotlight consciousness. They have lantern consciousness. They're taking in information from all different directions, which is very much like the psychedelic experience. And that somebody with that kind of mind was taking LSD seriously as a tool to understand something was a real signal to me that I had to dig into this.
So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the brain. ghoul. What do we know about the neurobiology? And in particular, I think the two psychedelic substances that seem most talked about today, or at least were featured most heavily in your book, are LSD and psilocybin, with slightly different mechanisms. But what is the common, what do we know about what's happening in the brain when people are on those drugs?
Yeah, so as Michael mentioned, when we first started working on this, we were focused on MDMA because my lab studies social behaviors, and we were looking at the developmental profile of, how animals learn from their social environment. And we discovered something called a critical period for social learning. And this notion of critical periods is actually not ours. It's been around in the neuroscience literature for almost 100 years. It was first described in the context of imprinting behavior in geese, which is this behavior that happens right after hatching. So for about 48 hours, a baby geese will form an imprinted bond to whatever's moving around in its environment. And then after that window, 48 hours closes, then they can be exposed to any old thing and they won't bond to it. And so that window of time is called a critical period. And there have been dozens of critical periods that have been described, so critical periods for language, critical periods for organizing the visual system of the brain, the touch system of the brain. And so we had discovered this social critical period. And we focused on MDMA because, unlike the other psychedelics, its main profile is that it has this incredibly pro-social effect. And so that was sort of our first insight, was that MDMA was able to reopen this critical period. And we thought, at the end of that paper, which was published in 2019, that was the end of the story. This was about MDMA being so pro-social. And then my postdoc, who was very tenacious and stubborn and often did not listen to what I had to say, did a control experiment where he looked at psilocybin and LSD and some of these other psychedelics. And those drugs are not really known for their particularly pro-social effects. Nobody's doing a 30-person cuddle puddle on LSD, right?
Is that Burning Man?
Hard to tell with the polypharmacy, but anyway, so we were really surprised that all of the psychedelics were reopening this critical period. And so that really shifted our way of thinking about it, because what it suggested is that it's not the pro-social property of the drug that's doing it, but that something about psychedelics in general is able to reopen this critical period. And that really reoriented the way we were thinking about them as not specific to social behaviors, because originally we thought, if we can explain this social part of it, we can explain why, for example, there's so much of a therapeutic alliance that's happening when people are doing MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. And we really thought it was all about the social, but this understanding that all of the psychedelics are doing, whether they're social or not, I think made us think, this is really about reopening windows of time for learning, and what you learn depends on what the context is when you're in that open state.
So that's a really important point, that I think a lot of the clinical trials that are going on now, the clinical applications are focused on is the impact, or should be at least, I know there's some controversy, about the context in which the substance is being taken. Michael, what do you think about can you separate the mechanism of the drug from the context in which it's taken?
They're very unusual drugs in that their effects are unpredictable in a lot of ways compared to other psychoactives. Think of cocaine or alcohol. There's a consistency to the physiological effect, whereas the classic psychedelics, a little less true for MDMA, can have very different effects depending on things like set and setting, as Timothy Leary famously defined the expectations you bring, and the physical setting you're in. And intention, too, can have a big effect. Not that it will always match your intention, but it can shape it in lots of ways. So in that sense, they're really unusual substances and open to having a variety of effects. But I think learning is very important to it. I think what's happening to people who are taking them to treat an addiction, say, or the anxiety and depression and demoralization at the end of life, they're learning new attitudes toward themselves, toward their addiction. And what's particularly interesting about it is how sticky those lessons learned on psychedelics are. William James talked about the noetic quality of the mystical experience, by which he meant it doesn't feel like an opinion or an insight, it feels like revealed truth. And so I remember talking to people who were treating their smoking addiction at Johns Hopkins with psilocybin, and they would tell me, these people would say, I had this amazing insight, that there's so much to do in the world, there's so much beauty, and why smoke and shorten your life? Okay, it's kind of like a banal insight. I'm sure they've had the thought before. But suddenly that thought was like etched in stone, and they could actually act on it. So there was, something was learned at a deep level.
I mean, I think that's different. I mean, a lot of the literature, for example, on alcohol intoxication shows that it's context-dependent learning. So if, for example, you were a bit buzzed when you were studying for the exam, you better get a little buzzed when you take the exam. This is not advice from a professor. But no, that's
a good piece of advice. Thank you for that.
But certainly, you don't remember when you're sober. You don't necessarily remember what happened, when you're inebriated. Though sometimes those memories can come back when you're in a similar state again. Not always, obviously. But that doesn't seem to be the case here.
No, memory actually, people's ability to remember psychedelic experience is really impressive. It's not like a dream at all. People can recall things 30 years ago with incredible precision.
Cool. Do you have any insights on how that's possible?
Yeah, I think that all of this sort of fits in the way that we're thinking about what critical periods are, right? So because we think that psychedelics are restoring the brain to that state of learning, that open state of the critical period that's similar to what they were when they were a child. And just like when you're a child, you learn things like a sponge, right? And you hold on to them and you formulate your whole worldview around the things that you learned. I think that is what this reopening of the critical period is describing. And I think it's interesting that, some of these state-dependent changes are following normal learning and memory rules, just the way that they are when you're a child, right? And so, you mentioned about state dependence. I did my postdoc at Stanford in an addiction lab. And there, at the time, so this was, 15 years ago, the dominant idea about addiction was, if you have an addiction, it's because you have some sort of impaired biochemical imbalance in dopamine. And we just have to fix that imbalance and you'll be back to not being a smoker or a heroin addict or whatever addiction. But even then, it was known that there are these weird state-dependent effects, right? So people who are addicted to heroin, if they take heroin in one specific area, one place all the time, then they can take much higher doses and not have, overdose. You move them to a different room, and suddenly a much smaller dose can be lethal, right? So these context-dependent or state-dependent effects have been known and are thought to be, how we learn and associate things in the world. And so I think that what the psychedelics are teaching us is that unlike the sort of biochemical imbalance model of diseases of the brain, that really it's about learning and memory. And so we are unlearning those associations through the help of this reopening of the critical period.
We kind of glossed over it a little bit, but I'd like to come back to this idea of set. So setting the physical context, the environment, the music, the whatever other perceptual, environment pieces there are, makes sense. But the set part, which is, I think you mean mindset.
Mindset, yeah.
is fascinating.
The internal environment, the setting,
Yeah,
the external.
that it has such a high impact on something that clearly has a neurochemical basis. I think that's often for us neuroscientists difficult to wrap our heads around, although of course it's obvious and we see this all the time in many of our experiments. But what do we know about this? What is the optimal mindset? How can it derail an experience?
Well, the researchers who are administering psychedelics to humans spend a lot of time preparing people, which is to say shaping their set. That can get them into trouble in a way in terms of bias. If you talk a lot about a mystical experience, which they do, or make people fill out repeated questionnaires that have judging your mystical experience, you're more likely to have one. And so it's a challenge. I mean, there are a lot of challenges to doing psychedelic research. It's a little different than studying other things just for these reasons. But they spend a lot of time in preparation. At Hopkins, they give people a set of flight instructions, which is like what you should do if certain things happen. Like if you see something frightening, don't run away. Face up to that monster and ask it, what do you have to teach me? And if you feel yourself dying or dissolving or exploding, don't fight it. Because if you do, the anxiety of trying to hold on to your ego structure when it's crumbling will make for a bad trip. So there's a lot of preparation to maximize the chances people don't have a bad trip. But the flip side of that, and it seems to make a difference, people in these, there seem to be less adverse events in these guided situations than there are people using psychedelics in the wild. Or, because people, take psychedelics walking down the street in Manhattan. It's not an optimal set or setting. So it makes a difference. But as I said, the downside is that you are sort of loading the dice in some ways.
So let's talk a little bit about the challenges of even clinical applications. You mentioned that the pharmaceutical companies aren't particularly motivated to invest the tens of millions of dollars that a clinical trial might require for two reasons. One, if it only takes one trip, that's not a repeat customer, so it's not like, you're gonna recoup all of that investment. And two, it's very hard to patent a mushroom. It just exists in nature.
Oh, people are doing it.
So, I'm sure, they patent peanut butter in the, trials for allergy therapy. So what is the current state of the clinical trial for these clinical applications? What do you see as some of the most promising uses? Are we going to get to a point where you can go and ask your doctor for a prescription? How does that relate to the context and setting? Those are a lot of questions, but
yeah. Well, I'd love to hear Gul on this.
Yeah.
But, I'll just throw out a couple thoughts. What you point to is right. The business model is not very good yet. People haven't figured out how to make money. The only people who are making money on psychedelics, I would say, are people running these high-end retreats in Mexico and Costa Rica and Jamaica. That business model is probably going to work. But if you're, our pharmaceutical industry wants drugs that you take every day for the rest of your life, and that's all you do is take the drug. But when we talk about psychedelic therapy, we're really talking about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, because the psychological support, the preparation that I described, sitting with someone for the whole day while they're having their experience, bringing them back the next day for an integration session. There are many, many hours of therapy that go with it, and there are usually two guides. And that's been a real problem all around. It's very expensive to do it that way, but it's also been a challenge for the FDA, which has no authority to regulate therapy. And so can they insist that therapy be part of it, that you're not just prescribing a pill that someone's going to take it home, and that wouldn't work. So there are a lot of challenges to bringing this into the mainstream. Nevertheless, I think we're close to that happening for a lot of reasons. One is because the drugs have proven their value in some cases, not in all. There's still a lot more research that needs to be done, but we've seen phase 3 results on using MDMA to treat trauma that have been very impressive, even though the FDA failed to regulate it. The other factor, though, we have to think about now is the political environment. The fact is, you have people at high levels in the Health and Human Services, including RFK Jr., and this guy, the new head of the FDA, and other people in the government who are very supportive of psychedelics, and they may push it through, with pure political muscle and nothing else, which I'm not sure is a good idea. In fact, I don't think it is. I think if psychedelics get approved because of a push from RFK Jr., I think that'll, who is scientifically, he's not even a quack scientist, he's not a scientist. He's a self-quack scientist. That will shadow psychedelic therapy forever.
I mean, we've seen sometimes, when it became associated with certain social movements, in the 70s, there was a backlash in the 80s when this sort of a similar situation happened. So I can see where...
Well, that's the positive side of having people on the right supporting psychedelics. And that was a very deliberate strategy of Rick Doblin at MAPS to reach out to people on the right for funding and for political support. And the fact that MDMA has been so helpful to veterans and other substances as well has, so we don't have the political divide we had in the 60s. And I think that's protective of psychedelics.
Cool, what do you see as the...
Yeah, so I just want to take it back for a second to talking about how to set the mindset, right? We have no way of doing that in a mouse. We don't know what their mindset is. We don't know what they're actually experiencing, but we can play with the setting, and we have shown that the setting matters. So if we give MDMA in a social setting, it reopens the social critical period. If we give it in an isolation setting, it doesn't. And I always follow up that description of that experiment by saying, well, this means that you can't give MDMA and go to a rave and expect to cure your PTSD. But more recently, as we've sort of started thinking about, what this critical period explanation really suggests, we've been thinking, well, maybe going to an all-night dance party is exactly the right mindset and setting for treating neurological disorders like stroke. Right? And so one of the clinical trials that we're working on right now is to change the preparation, not have it, we're having to push back with our colleagues at Johns Hopkins on, giving those kind of those instructions for how to deal with a difficult trip that are related to the psychological journey. And instead we're saying, no, we don't want any psychological experience, no inner-directed trip. Instead, we're going to focus on breathing, focus on, providing them support that doesn't have anything to do with the psychological journey.
And no blindfolds and no
blindfolds.
Headphones?
No, they'll have headphones, but it'll be dance music instead of, interactive. And we're preparing them with a meditation, and they'll have occupational and physical therapists instead of psychotherapists in the room with them. And I think that this is interesting from a scientific point of view, but also speaks to kind of the difference between neurology and psychiatry, right? So psychiatry has a history of the last 50 years or so trapped in this business model of medicalizing people for life by thinking of neurological, psychiatric disease as a biochemical imbalance. And so when I start talking about the importance of these very expensive therapy-based trials and studies, sometimes I'll get pushback from, drug companies or representatives of those drug companies. Oh, you're just in an ivory tower. You don't know how expensive therapy is. And I always push back by saying, listen, if you had a patient who came in with a stroke and you cleared their blood clot, and then you said, I'm sorry, physical therapy or occupational therapy is just too expensive, you go on home, that would never happen, right? And so I think the importance of moving little bit to challenge the status quo around how we approach psychiatric illness and take some of the models from, cardiovascular disease. We definitely give people plenty of time for rest and integration after a heart attack, after stroke. We give them learning, and this is done because it's the most effective way to address these illnesses.
And insurance covers all that
And
stuff.
insurance covers it.
Insurance is very limited in what it'll cover for behavioral health.
Right.
I mean, I always thought that the things that are missing from the rehab centers are the rapes. I love that idea, and Ghoul, I heard a rumor that you're saving one of your best trips for, when you have a stroke. So tell us why. What is there, are we preventing ourselves from potentially having this kind of life-saving treatment if we're going on trips every weekend?
Well, part of the reason for this is that, and we learn a lot from talking to people who are psychonauts who've done a lot of psychedelics in their lifetime. And one of the things that people mention is that after, doing psychedelics for years repeatedly, that big sort of overwhelming mystical experience or noetic experience, that fades. And mechanistically, we have a little bit of a guess, a hypothesis that matters. That the way that the neural mechanisms get reset and for a critical period to be open is that the synapse needs to detect that there's a big change in the statistics of the normal firing patterns. And we have, I won't get into the weeds of why we think that, but I think that if they become, we normally are experiencing the world, and it is actually a pretty magical and mystical thing, but we're used to it. And so I think with psychedelics, the way that they're able to reopen is in part because we're not used to it. It's so overwhelming. And the analogy I like to give for that is, imagine that you're on a Zoom call, for example, and the screen starts to flicker. You probably won't reset after that, you just wait for the flicker to go away. But if it freezes for a couple of seconds, then you'll hit the reset button, and you maybe go reset the Wi-Fi, if not the Zoom. And so I think that the same kind of mechanism is happening with psychedelics, and I'm worried that if you use up all of your big, wild, mystical experiences, and you've used psychedelics so much that you're not having that anymore, that it won't work when you need it for later in life when you're trying to recover from a stroke.
So what about microdosing? Does that have some of the same, potential problems? Does it work? Does it do anything? At least in the creativity world, there's scant evidence that microdosing actually does measurably make people more creative, although it certainly makes them think they're more creative.
Which might be just as good.
It might be just as good, absolutely.
Yeah.
I never want to underplay the importance of the placebo effect, but I will say that we have looked at microdoses of psilocybin and it doesn't reopen the critical period. Now, I can't 100% say that, that's not because we're below the detection threshold for our assay, but all of the studies that we've conducted have been at macro doses. The other sort of thing that I think was surprising from our studies was that I think a lot of people have this intuition that, the bigger the experience, the bigger the trip, the more impactful it will be. But what we found instead was that it's not the intensity of the trip that matters so much as the duration of the trip. So we saw this correlation between, short trip equals short open state of the critical period, long trip, long open state of the critical period, which is why we think that Ibogaine, which has the longest trip of any psychedelic that we know of, lasting between 36 to 72 hours, super long trip, right? It's one of the, but at the same time, you have these people, these veterans talking about it, and they're like, well, I'll never do that again, and that was just too long. But also, I don't want to do heroin anymore. And I actually do think that there might be some relationship between the abuse liability of psychedelics and how long and difficult the trip is, right? Like after you've climbed Mount Everest, you probably aren't going to get it, well, I don't want to speak for mountain climbers because I don't understand their brains at all. But in any case, I think that this is part of it. And so for us, this is exciting because it suggests that, when we're looking at, future directions, there are a lot of drug companies who are trying to shorten the trip so that they can give this out as pills that you can take at home, and for us, we think that shortening the trip in that way is going to interfere with the therapeutic effect if it's really about this learning and memory through critical periods.
So pharmaceutical companies, in addition to doing that, are also trying to develop psychedelics that have no psychedelic effects. And your theory of how it works is very much dependent on the experience, right?
Yeah.
So is it your hunch that won't work?
Yeah, I think that it won't work. Like the tripless psychedelics, I don't have a lot of hope that will be a productive way. And I think that anecdotally, I want to defend that argument because it's really kind of at the heart of the debate right now, right? Like there are all the companies that are trying to develop new patentable molecules that are either tripless psychedelics or, in some other way have gotten rid of the psychedelic side effects and or made them change their abuse liability. And then there's the other side of the debate, which is around the therapy is the thing that matters. And part of why I think that that's true is because we think that somehow the set or the previous set of thoughts that you're having when you're beginning the trip are activating the right, a subset of neural networks, and that priming of the neural circuits comes back up when you are having the big journey. And that, under those circumstances of the psychedelic trip, because you're in this sort of more flexible way of interpreting information that's coming in, you're able to find new pathways and solve the problem in a different way. So, going back to the smoking example that Michael brought up, some people will talk about how, they had an epiphany, and it was like they discovered that, Santa Claus wasn't real, right? And so I think that and then the next day it was like, well, leaving out cookies and hoping that a fat man is going to bring me presents just seems silly. And so the solving of the problem is they found a different way of understanding why they smoked, the relationship to that desire to smoke and their relationship to the world. And I think that exploration happens during the journey itself.
So Michael, you recently published a piece in the New Yorker, which I think has one of the best titles ever, High Priests.
Not everyone agreed.
It's about religious leaders who go on psychedelic trips and meet their deities and so on. What were some of the main insights that you found really compelling from that?
It was a fascinating study and a bizarre study when you think about it. So at Johns Hopkins and NYU, the same team that have worked together on several different studies, had this idea that they would give a high dose of psilocybin to religious leaders in a range of denominations. There were Catholic priests, Eastern Orthodox priests, Episcopal priests, ministers, and a lot of Protestant denominations, rabbis, one imam, and the joke about walking into a bar just kind of writes itself. And to sort of see what would happen, the research questions were a little bit vague, but interesting. And the takeaways were that, and all these people were psychedelically naive, so it was their first experience, going back to that novelty idea, which I agree is probably very important. What are some of the top line results? Well, everyone but the Buddhist had a divine encounter. The Buddhist told me that she traveled to a realm beyond concept for which she had no words. It's beautiful. God in all cases was not embodied, it was a presence felt. The Muslim said, I knew if I turned around, God was right behind me, as close to me as my jugular vein. For a majority, this is of the people I interviewed, for a majority of them, God was feminine. This blew their minds. I mean, this was the man too. He said, my whole understanding of patriarchal religion was shattered. The Baptist said God was a lot, who was a woman, said God was a lot like a Jewish mother. So anyway, what was, I think, significant was, for the researchers, were two things. One was that, there's been this whole discussion of the mystical experience that you can kind of reliably occasion with a high dose of psilocybin. Usually about 2/3 of the people in these studies all seem to have this experience, which is not, it was defined by William James more than 100 years ago. It's a sense of self-transcendence and well-being, and a sense that yourself has dissolved and you've become part of something larger than yourself. The ego has melted away, and that this has been, there's a whole literature of mysticism and religion of people having these experiences. And the question for the researchers has been, is this real or merely a drug effect? What does real mean in this case? And everyone in this study felt, who had a mystical experience, and like 90% of them did, a small sample, felt it was absolutely authentic. This is what they've been reading about in the religious texts in the history of mysticism. They were completely persuaded of its authenticity. So that was kind of interesting. The other thing that was interesting is this is a very high burnout profession. And a lot of these people had become sort of disaffected. It's very hard work, it's very bureaucratic, attendance is going down, and a lot of them were renewed in their faith and in their vocation and rededicated themselves to what they were doing. The uncomfortable finding for the researchers, I think, was that several people did have a conversion experience to psychedelics. And they, 3 people left their jobs to start organizations to bring psychedelics into their church. This is popular in some circles, but was uncomfortable because the researchers have been charged with trying to inject psychedelics into organized religion. But several of the people I interviewed felt that, if you want to revive religion, what religion is missing now is an experiential component, a powerful experiential component. It's, in many cases, been reduced to tradition and belief and ritual. And so we'll see where that goes. There was a rabbi did this, local person named Zach Kamenetz has started a new group called Shefa. Hun priest, an Episcopal priest, started a group called the Gare, and I'm forgetting the name of the Muslim group right now, but the idea was to create a specifically Muslim container for the psychedelic experience. So it was a fascinating study. It got embroiled in some controversy around these issues, for me, it was such a privilege interviewing these people. I mean, these are incredibly articulate people. They had a lot to say. They were incredibly thoughtful and nuanced in their descriptions of the experience. So it was a real privilege.
So the next person that walks into the bar is the octopus, right? So Gul, tell us, what happens when you give, is it psilocybin or LSD to an octopus?
We actually gave them MDMA.
Oh, okay.
We did not give them, and the MDMA was chosen because, you know, despite what you might have seen on Netflix, octopuses did not evolve to cuddle men going through their livers. They are viciously asocial for the most part, and so we were curious, you know, what would happen to an asocial animal if we gave them MDMA. And when we gave them MDMA, unbelievably, and we were really surprised by this result, they showed the same social preference as if they were a rodent or a human. They started preferring being in the chamber with the other octopus. And this was surprising for a lot of reasons. One of them is because octopuses and humans, their last common ancestor was 650 million years ago. So just to give you a sense of the time there, you know, dinosaurs have come and gone in the interim. We are more closely related to a starfish than we are to an octopus. Their brains look nothing like ours. And, you know, for me, this was the reason that we did this experiment is, you know, when I first started working and started my own lab, you know, there were a lot of researchers who were saying, well, you can't really understand the cool, interesting parts of psychedelics by studying animals. You know, what does a mouse seeing God look like anyway? So, you know, and so there was a lot of push to only focus on fMRI imaging and giving people psychedelics and asking them, you know, asking the question, what changes on a brain scan? And this didn't sit well with me, and really the octopus experiment, I think, fundamentally challenges this idea that we can